Welcome to Freedom Fighters Code Grey. This is a show where we discuss human trafficking, an issue that's happening all across Canada. Please note that some of the content in today's show may be triggering, as we will be dealing with subject matter related to trauma and exploitation. If you're looking for information and support related to human trafficking, you can call the Human Trafficking Hotline 24/7 at 1-833-900-1010. Again, that's 1-833-900-1010. Today, I'm joined by Julia Cusato, who's a sexual exploitation prevention educator, and she's going to be discussing her knowledge on this topic. Welcome, Julia.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here.
Thanks for coming all the way to have this conversation in person.
Of course, I think it's an important one.
Yes, I totally agree. And so this show is all about human trafficking. And some of the folks who are joining this episode or might be listening in may be wondering, like, what is human trafficking and what does it look like here in Canada? Could you just take some time to explain what exactly human trafficking is?
Sure, absolutely. So I typically work with, when it comes to sex trafficking, so that is my area of focus. And so when it comes to sex trafficking, there are specifically 3 to 4 particular pieces that are engaged in sex trafficking. And that is force, fraud, and coercion. And that's how I like to break down the definition. The United Nations has a great definition of sex trafficking. It's a little long and complex, but these 3 components are in there. So when it comes to force, typically an individual is being forced to do something that they haven't consented to, and there is some sort of like physical harm, emotional harm that happens in that way. So they're being forced. Then there is fraud. So oftentimes the trafficker doesn't really tell this person what their intentions are. They switch up really quickly. So what we do know is that traffickers will often trick the victim into doing things that they didn't expect that they were going to do, and they didn't expect the relationship to go in that particular direction. So they're frauding that victim. And then there's coercion. So that victim gets threatened, that victim gets manipulated into going into the sex trade. So that's typically how I like to break down sex trafficking.
And what does human trafficking kind of look like as, you know, it actually takes form within Canada? Because I feel like there's a lot of preconceived notions of like, oh, this is what human trafficking looks like based on a movie or a film or something like that, or media representations. But like, what does it actually look like? What's actually happening on the ground?
So oftentimes, most people are familiar with the movie Taken. Have you seen Taken? And that's like a really dramatized case of like a person being kidnapped and then put into the sex trade, and it doesn't really look like that here, especially with what I've seen in a lot of the different schools across Ontario and what young people are experiencing. So oftentimes a trafficker is going to look for a vulnerable young person, and we can definitely talk about what some of those vulnerabilities are. They range from like individual vulnerabilities to like systemic and social vulnerabilities, but they're going to look for a vulnerable young person. There's going to be some cues and markers, and then they're going to try and engage with that young person and try to build normally a romantic relationship with them. So what they're going to try to do is pretend to be that person's boyfriend or girlfriend and really start to engage and build a relationship with that young person. And that young person most of the time is going to fall head over heels in love with this person, and then slowly the relationship is going to change. And so we tend to see this more and more happening here in Canada, where young people are getting exploited even online. So they're building relationships with strangers that they don't know. The stranger is learning a lot of information about them, making them feel really special, engaging them in a relationship. And if it's not a romantic relationship, then they're going to try to build some sort of close friendship with that person and get them engaged until eventually the relationship switches up, and then that young person is at danger of being exploited.
I think that was a really helpful explanation, because like you mentioned the movie Taken, and so many people reference that, right? And they're thinking it's like it only happens through kidnapping, or in this context, or internationally, or whatever it is, where it's like, with the online digital space, you mentioned like there's luring and grooming happening there, but then also it can happen through like a romantic relationship or a friendship that's formed, and how that individual then eventually seeks to exploit that person. Now, you mentioned something interesting in your response. You talked about like that there are things potentially that traffickers are looking for in a young person to prey upon them and lure them into a trafficking situation. And then you also mentioned that there's like social and systemic structural things that are creating vulnerabilities, if you will, as it relates to trafficking. Could you just shed some light on both of those, both individual vulnerabilities that could potentially happen, as well as like the social structural part?
Sure, awesome. So when we think of individual vulnerabilities, oftentimes most of us have vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are completely normal. I think learning about our vulnerabilities is really important in one way that we can start to support young people with getting comfortable with who they are. But some of those individual vulnerabilities look like a person who maybe has a lower sense of self-esteem, maybe a person who is seeking connection, who wants love, who wants relationships, who wants friendships, those particular pieces. Maybe they're more insecure, maybe they are more closed off, and all of those pieces are individual little vulnerabilities that traffickers will look out for. And then the bigger social and systemic pieces are people's like backgrounds, so their race, where they come from, if they have any sort of disabilities, if they have experienced any form of trauma in their past, like sexual violence outside of the trafficking relationship. Traffickers can prey on those vulnerabilities as well. So that's how I would differentiate between those individual vulnerabilities and social and systemic pieces. And oftentimes the individuals who get exploited, it can really range. Some of them might just have that one vulnerability. Maybe they just really don't feel like they fit in anywhere, and the trafficker brings them into this friend group, brings them into this lifestyle, and now they have a place that they are engaging in, and they have a relationship with this person who they start to really care about, and they're exploited that way. Or maybe a person has a number of different vulnerabilities, and the trafficker is going to play on all of them. So it really depends. Even just one is enough for a trafficker to really latch onto and bring a person into the sex trade.
I think it was really interesting when you're saying like it's important to reflect on like where like someone's own vulnerability might be, because like, yeah, that can be interpreted in so many different ways. But I remember looking like at a slide of like, these are potential risk factors to experiencing trafficking, and being like, I personally resonate with so many of those. Or like if I look back to even when I was like an adolescent, like that number increased, right? And so just knowing that like one of the risk factors that are like often mentioned or cited is like wanting to be loved. And it's like, okay, well, like who doesn't want to be loved, right? So I think it's like so important for people who are listening to know that like trafficking can happen to anyone, right? Regardless of like an obvious risk factor is present or not, like trafficking can happen to anyone in our community. And so I'm wondering if you can actually share a little bit about like who are some of the people who are maybe being trafficked and exploited in Canada, and then also like who are the traffickers? Like who are those people typically in the Canadian context?
Sure. I think when we think about the Canadian context, something really important to think about is the fact that we have like the 401. So the 401 is like a massive corridor when it comes to trafficking. Traffickers will bring individuals all across the 401, and then right off the 401 on almost any major exit, there is oftentimes hotels or motels that the trafficker will bring those specific individuals to. So what I like to say is that nobody's exempt from trafficking. If you have any sort of vulnerability, a trafficker can latch onto that vulnerability and then pull an individual into the sex trade. We do know, however, the average age of recruitment into the sex trade is the age of 13. And that is going significantly lower and lower, where individuals are a lot younger and engaging, especially when it comes to social media, especially when it comes to online. So lots of things to think about. When it comes to mostly statistics, we do know that I think it's around 90%, and don't quote me on that one because that's always, we don't have accurate statistics. I think I'll start with saying that. We don't really necessarily know the numbers because a lot of victims, for a number of reasons, don't necessarily come forward or report, and that's totally fair. So it's hard to really gauge really good statistics on what human trafficking is actually looking like in Canada. But we do know that most victims are female. That's not to say that this doesn't happen to males, or especially the 2S LGBTQ plus community as well. Those are some vulnerabilities involved in there too. And but mostly young women are getting engaged in trafficking. Traffickers are looking for them. Traffickers are reaching out to them. And when it comes to who is trafficking them, oftentimes we might think of like a movie like Taken. So an older individual, maybe a creepy older man is like the stereotype that gets pegged. But honestly, I've seen individuals trafficking other individuals in high schools. So you have someone in grade 12 trafficking somebody in grade 10. So we're seeing that as well. It might not look as big as something like Taken, where that individual is being kidnapped and brought across to another country, but they're still being forced to engage in sexual encounters where there is some sort of like compensation happening for that individual continuing to engage. So we've seen all of that as well.
I think what you highlighted, that like when we're referencing stats and things like that, it's so important. Yeah, for folks to know, like, this is such a difficult issue to quantify for so many different reasons, like as you mentioned, and it's predominantly happening to women and girls, but like we know like there's a rise in boys too, especially with the digital space and like sextortion and things like that, right? Where like boys are specifically being targeted through video games and things like that, right? So it's really just impacting so many different people in our communities, and it is such a big problem. So as I think about some of the things you're sharing, someone listening might be like, okay, so if this like could happen to like people in high school or younger, we're seeing it happen at the elementary age, like what are some of the signs and indicators of someone being trafficked? Like how can people kind of like look out for, so to speak, possible things that they're going, something doesn't seem right? It's like what can help people potentially identify a potential trafficking situation?
For sure, that's a great question. I think it's so important to think about those red flags and those warning signs. So some of the early signs, like there's early and then there's individuals who already are engaging in the sex trade, and those are some later signs. But some of those early signs, if all of a sudden a person has a new individual in their life who's never been there, and this individual is now really closely engaged, is with them all the time. They're saying that they want to speak to this person all the time, or maybe don't feel comfortable speaking without this person around. We want to understand who this person is. What are their intentions? So there's a new person here. If all of a sudden the person is starting to potentially skip school or a dip in their grades when that hasn't necessarily happened before, maybe they are overly exhausted. Maybe they're staying up all night. What are they doing throughout the night? Maybe they are going out later and later with a new crowd. Maybe their friend group has switched from this one group who they used to hang out with, and now they're hanging out with a bit of an older crowd. And what does that look like? Maybe they are starting to engage at a younger age in drinking, smoking, drugs, those kinds of behaviors. Maybe they're engaging with more sexually explicit content and materials as well. Oftentimes we see a change in how a person is dressing as well, and those are some indicators. So for example, if a person is all of a sudden getting a whole bunch of material items, oftentimes traffickers will gift their victims really big, really high, expensive ticketed items so that that individual can like feel good about themselves and flaunt that off as well. So we see that happening. So maybe they have new shoes, new bags. When it comes to potentially males who are trafficked, we might see the latest technology and things like that they're getting and engaging in. Or sometimes it's the complete reverse, where a person, like their hygiene starts to change. So they're not taking care of themselves. They're wearing very baggy clothes. So usually it's one end or the other is typically what we see.
So regardless of like, there are so many different, indicators that were presented, and it sounds like there's a significant behavior change that occurs where you can say, okay, like something is happening in this person's life that is resulting in these various changes, whether it's like an appearance or what they're engaging in or their peer group or things like that. So if someone like was to observe some of those signs, what would be like a way that you would suggest that they interact with that individual who may potentially be in a trafficking situation? What would you recommend to that like friend or support person? Because when you were sharing, one of the things that came to mind for me was like healthcare professionals and how like the very first example you gave of like not being able to speak for yourself, right? Because often like a trafficker may have all that person's identification, and so like not answering the questions for them or be hovering around as they get assessed in a medical space. And so we know that they have a potential role to intervene in a situation, but like how do people begin that conversation, or what do they do if they suspect someone's being trafficked?
Yeah, great question. I think to go back and touch in on that point a little bit more, I think what I was thinking about is that those risk factors, it could potentially be that the person's being trafficked, but they could also be warning signs of so many other things: sexual assault, different forms of sexual violence, maybe family violence within the home. So there's a number of other things that we could look for. So just because a person is exemplifying like one or two of these changes in their behavior and their appearance doesn't necessarily mean that trafficking is happening, but we still want to engage because something else could be happening. And at the end of the day, we want to protect our young people. And that is our goal, right? So we still want to reach out, we still want to engage regardless of if it's sex trafficking or if it's something else. The young person might look like they need that support. So I think what we can do and how we can like start that conversation and start to engage is just really opening up those lines of communication. When it comes to young people, often you might ask them like, how's it going? Or how are you doing? Or like, is anything wrong? And oftentimes they'll brush you off, right? It's like, oh, I'm fine, or I don't want to talk, or give you that total cold shoulder, and that's so fair. But I think continuing to engage and ask those questions shows that you care. And young people want that. They want to see that. And sometimes they'll start off the conversation in a very like outlandish way. They're trying to test you to see how you're going to respond. Oftentimes, maybe they'll drop a big piece of information that sounds really scary. Maybe it's not even something that's happened to them, but they're trying to see where in which they can take the conversation. Are you capable of having that conversation with them? Are you going to judge them? Are you going to shame them? Or are you going to open up that space and give them the freedom to talk?
That's so great. Well, thank you so much, Julia, for taking the time to share your expertise with us today. We'll be back after we take a short break. Hi, and welcome back to Freedom Fighters Code Gray, a show where we discuss human trafficking. In today's episode, I am joined by Julia, who is sharing her expertise on sexual exploitation and prevention education. And so, Julia, we just were talking about, opening up conversations with young people about trafficking and the importance of doing that. And before you can really open up that conversation, caregivers need to understand a little bit about what trafficking is and all of that stuff. So I'm just wondering, what do you think is most important for caregivers of children and youth to know about sex trafficking?
Sure. I think I'd like to start off that question with saying something along the lines of most families don't expect that something like this is going to happen to them. Even in the most tight-knit families where there's communication happening, things like trafficking can happen. A young person can become exploited of no fault of their own. They can just fall into the hands of the wrong person who has the wrong intentions, and that can really happen. So I think that's the first piece of understanding that it's not necessarily anyone's fault that an individual has experienced this, and it's very overwhelming to learn this information as well. So I would say that finding some avenue towards education is really important. There's so many resources out there, and we can talk a little bit about them afterwards as well. And it's a great idea to get yourself educated on what those warning signs look like, what is happening. Because even if it's not necessarily in someone's own family unit, whether it's their children or the people around them, it could be a neighborhood child. It could be somebody that a person goes to school with. The more people who know, the more things that we can identify when it comes to protecting young people. So I would just start there, start with the warning signs, start understanding what trafficking looks like. Again, it doesn't look much like Taken when it comes to our young people. We want to really understand their experience and what's happening. And I would also suggest for the parents and caregivers, I'm not a parent or a caregiver myself, so I think it's always hard to spread the information, but there's so much will to learn, and I appreciate that so much. Is get online with your young people. Sit with your young person as they are playing a video game, understand what that video game looks like. Is there a chat function in that video game? Is there the ability for that person to engage or add another friend that they don't know? We need to understand how these systems work. I think that's really important.
I love that example that you're just highlighting. If your youth is using video games, join them in it and understand how it works. Because to have a conversation about some of these things, it's important to learn. And it can be overwhelming because technology is moving so rapidly and so quickly. But I feel even just asking your kid, can you show me how this works? They're just so excited and ready to be yeah, this is how this operates, or this is a cool function, and just having a conversation on that front. And so along the lines of conversations, what is a way that a caregiver could open up a discussion about trafficking? What should they do? Maybe let's just start with beforehand. Sure. Before that conversation even starts, what are some of the things that they should be doing?
Sure. So I would say that if there are even no warning signs at all, and we just want to educate our young people on what trafficking is. I think when a youth comes to a certain age, I think if we're thinking about the age of recruitment being 13, we would ideally want to target young people before that and open up a conversation about what people's intentions are and what that looks like and what exploitation is and what being forced to do something is, and educating our young people on consent at such a young age is so important. And there's definitely resources for age-appropriate consent. We don't necessarily need to talk to our young people at such a young age about sex, but we can definitely talk to them about what it looks like if somebody violates their values and their boundaries and what to do then, right? So I think starting the conversation off on that way a lot younger is great. But if we are concerned about a young person that they are engaging in something or that something is happening to them and we're not sure, but there's some warning signs, then I would definitely start with having a conversation with that person about just that. So targeting that. So saying hey, I've I've noticed X, Y, and Z happening, or like in your behavior, like I'm really concerned about you, like I really love you, like can we find a time where we can sit down and talk about this? So you never want to spring the conversation on the young person. You want to see if you can build out a time. Like maybe they have a lot of homework going on right now, or they have something else that they are paying attention to and are attending to. We want to be aware of that as well. We want to give them the choice to decide when we can start to have that conversation with them. So I would say that first, and then also sharing like our love and our care for them. Like I want to have this conversation because I care about you, because I've noticed these things. Like I'm not judging you, like I'm just here to support you in whatever that looks like. That's how I would start that conversation.
I think what you're highlighting there, just in terms of like having like a non-judgmental approach and an open approach, and also just like not the element of surprise, right? Where someone can just think about and be prepared to have a conversation, is a really thoughtful way to go about it. So then, like during the conversation or after the conversation takes place, like what are some other things that caregivers can do to support youth as it relates to either addressing potential behavior signs of trafficking or preventing it from happening?
Sure, I think if a young person then starts to share some pretty overwhelming information, I think it can be overwhelming for anyone to hear that, especially a caregiver when you love that person so much and you're so concerned about their well-being. So I think it's totally okay to take some breaks, to take some deep breaths, to come back to the conversation, maybe even a safe word getting used with the youth. If the youth becomes very overwhelmed, maybe we can find a safe word to tap out. I know I had a conversation with one family and they used banana. Like banana was their word of like, okay, I need like a 2-minute break. We just need to get some water and then come back. Things are getting escalated. And I think it's really important during the conversation that caregivers know that they don't have to have all the answers. They don't necessarily need to know what to do immediately, because that's for the after of the conversation. After that conversation's happening, we've gathered some of that information, we can contact some resources and get that additional support.
That's great, Julia. And in terms of like that resources and additional support, are there any specific resources that you would recommend for caregivers?
Definitely. So I think the Victim Services Directory is a really great one. Maybe we can link that somewhere. So there's typically a victim services unit in every region, and they tend to work with individuals who've become victimized, or if there's even a potential there, they can do some education around that too. And most of them have like a human trafficking unit where they are spreading the awareness and spreading the education. I definitely know that Victim Services Toronto, Victim Services Durham region are doing that work for sure. So I think that that's a great place to start. So just looking up the victim services that's closest to you, giving them a call, they can direct you to resources. I know that Kids Help Phone is a great one that young people can get directed to as well if something's going on. Also, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, that's a really popular resource as well to get some information. And starting in those directions, I think, is typically a good one.
That's great. Thanks, Julia. We'll definitely have those links available like in the description of the show so that people can access them readily. Perfect. Now, in our discussion, and as we're talking about like supporting caregivers with trafficking, I'm just wondering, as you're reflecting on these conversations and these different like tips that you're providing for folks, like, is there anything else that you would share with caregivers in particular as it relates to addressing human trafficking in Canada in today's age?
Absolutely. So I definitely think that going back to that vulnerabilities piece is really important. I think that there's a power dynamic for sure when it comes to young people and then the caregivers, right? The caregivers are in most of the time the position of power. They're looking to their young people to see how they can protect and how they can support them. But I think sometimes that power imbalance can make young people feel like if they've done something wrong or if they've engaged in something, be very scared to approach. So opening up those lines of communication is one thing, but also when a caregiver can share their own vulnerabilities with young people in a very healthy and appropriate way, I think is a great approach to extend that hand to the young person and say, listen, I'm not a perfect person. I am also a person who's made mistakes. There's also things that have happened to me in this life. Like, can we just have a bit of an open conversation around that? I'm here for you in the same way that I want to make sure that you're safe and make sure that you're okay.
That's awesome. That's really great advice, Julia. You've also talked about like video games and social media and things like that. And you know, with the digital space, I just feel like it's like opened up avenues really for exploitation. But what is important for folks to know about how social media and trafficking are related?
Awesome. I think that's great. I think that oftentimes our young people are not necessarily aware or don't have yet the understanding that what they post online can live out there forever. Sometimes it can even affect a person's job opportunities in the future, their education, etc., but they don't have any sort of concept of what that looks like. But what then happens is that young people start to put their whole life online, right? They're sharing online, they're connecting, that is their norm, day to day today. So I think the thing that's important is having that conversation with young people about what they're putting on their social media. What does that look like? How can we still engage in a really fun way, but also not necessarily put our full name out there, or put like what school we go to, or not tag our location? I think those are key indicators, because traffickers are looking for specific vulnerabilities, and they also have a system to look for it online. So if you have a young person potentially posting like song lyrics of heartbreak, right, and their account is open and they're posting all of these pictures, and maybe they've posted themselves having a bad day, and then follow up with like, you know, some Taylor Swift song lyrics, because we all love Taylor Swift, right? But they're on there, and then a stranger is seeing this, and maybe it's not necessarily even a stranger, but someone, a friend of a friend, and their intentions are wrong and their intentions are bad. They might see this person as vulnerable and then start to engage and start to ask like, hey, it seems like you're having a bad day. Can we have a conversation? Like, how are you? I think I know you. You go to X, Y, and Z school. You know this person. We have these mutual friends. It creates an opportunity for engagement around a particular potential vulnerability that a trafficker will then potentially exploit.
That was some really helpful insights to understand, just like traffickers are online, right? Like, and they're looking at these different things that people are posting to either like connect with them on some level, or like, you know, even like offer like a fake form of support or love, or whether that's buying them something or sending them words of affirmation or any of those things. And so like they're in those space watching what our kids are doing and looking for an opportunity to connect for nefarious purposes. And so the way you just described that makes a lot of great sense. I'm just wondering, like, within the last minute we have or so, is there anything else that you would like to add about our conversation today?
I would say that this topic is very scary and it's very overwhelming, and getting some education to start off is just the best place, I think. That's the best place to start to protect our young people. And I think that it's not one person's responsibility to know everything and know exactly what to do, but for us as a whole community to come together. So the more people who are informed and engaged, the more we can help out our young people.
You've mentioned like a lot of great resources, but really quickly, is there any like education-based resource that you think is really great that people should be aware of?
Absolutely. I would definitely start off with the victim service places. I think that there is a big number of education there.
Okay, that's great. Well, Julia, thank you so much for taking the time to just share your insights and expertise on this topic with our viewers. It's been so great to have this conversation with you today. If you are tuning into the show and you're looking for information and support related to human trafficking, you can call the Human Trafficking Hotline 24/7 at 1-833-900-1010. Again, that's 1-833-900-1010. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of Freedom Fighters Code Gray, and we hope to catch you next time.